Welcome back to the show. Today we're diving into the intersection of AI and creative expression. There was a gap between two walls so narrow that not even a grown cat could fit inside it. And yet, something was crying in there. A tiny voice, barely audible, coming from somewhere no one could reach. For 3 days, that cry never stopped. Nobody knew there was a kitten trapped inside a wall until someone finally heard him. But to understand how he ended up there, we have to go back to where this all began. It started behind an old apartment building in a narrow alley most people walked past without a second glance. A litter of kittens had been born there, hidden under a broken staircase with no mother in sight for days at a time. Most of the litter had already scattered, chasing warmth wherever they could find it. One tiny orange kitten, barely a few weeks old, wandered further than the rest. He was smaller than his siblings, thinner, with fur so pale it almost looked white in the shadows. He was looking for somewhere safe, somewhere warm, somewhere no bigger animals could reach him. And that search led him straight into a crack between two crumbling walls. The alley behind that building had seen its share of strays over the years. Cats came and went, some finding homes, most simply disappearing into the city the way strays often do. Nobody kept track of a single orange kitten who wandered off from a litter nobody had reported in the first place. At first, it must have felt safe in there, tight, enclosed, protected. But kittens grow fast, even in just a few days, and what once felt like shelter quickly became a trap. He tried to turn around. He couldn't. He tried to climb back the way he came. He couldn't do that either. So he did the only thing he had left. He cried. He cried for hours that turned into a full day, and then another. A woman named Sarah lived in the building next door, and on the third night, she heard something she couldn't explain. A thin, desperate sound coming from somewhere inside the wall separating the two properties. At first, she thought it was a bird, then a rat. But when she pressed her ear against the cold concrete, she realized it was crying like something small and frightened, something alive. But what she found next would change everything. She grabbed the flashlight and searched every inch of that alley until she found the gap, barely wide enough for her hand. And there, deep inside, two tiny eyes blinked back at her. A kitten, wedged so tightly between the walls that he couldn't move an inch in either direction. Sarah couldn't reach him with her hands. The gap was too narrow, too deep, too dangerous to force anything larger inside. She thought about calling animal control, but it was the middle of the night, and something told her that if she left, even for an hour, she might come back to silence instead of crying. She wasn't willing to take that chance, so she did the only thing she could do. She knelt down in that alley in the middle of the night and slid one finger into the crack. The kitten latched onto it immediately, desperate for any contact, any proof that he wasn't alone anymore. She couldn't pull him out that night, but she could feed him. Drop by drop, she fed him through that tiny gap using nothing but her fingertip, terrified that if she stopped, he might not survive until morning. If this story is already pulling at something in you, you're not the only one. Please hit subscribe. Every single subscriber tells us these stories are worth telling. Little did anyone know, that first night of feeding was only the beginning of a much longer fight. For 4 days, Sarah returned to that gap every few hours. She called every contractor, every neighbor, every person she could think of who might know how to open a wall without hurting what was trapped inside it. Most people told her it wasn't worth the trouble. It's just a stray kitten, they said. There are hundreds of them. But Sarah couldn't walk away from a tiny voice that had chosen to trust a stranger's finger over silence and starvation. On the 4th day, a local handyman agreed to help, carefully removing a section of loose brick just wide enough to reach inside without crushing anything on the other side. It took almost 2 hours of careful, painstaking work, chipping away brick by brick, while Sarah kept talking softly into the gap so the kitten would know she hadn't left. Every few minutes, the crying would stop, and her heart would stop right along with it, until a small paw pushed against her finger again, and she knew he was still holding on. And then, at exactly 6:15 in the morning, as the sun came up over that alley, a small, trembling orange kitten was finally lifted out into the light. He didn't fight, he didn't scratch. He He simply pressed his tiny face into Sarah's hands and stayed there, shaking. What she felt in that moment would stay with her for the rest of her life. He weighed almost nothing. His eyes were crusted nearly shut, but his heart, she said, was beating so fast it felt like it might burst straight through his tiny chest. She named him Sunny because even after everything, he had never once stopped reaching toward the light. The first few weeks were fragile. He needed to be bottle-fed every few hours, wrapped in blankets, kept warm against her chest through the night. He was terrified of open spaces at first, always trying to squeeze himself into the smallest, tightest corner of any room he was placed in. Old habits, born from days spent trapped, don't disappear overnight. Sarah slept on the floor beside his little bed for the first 2 weeks, just so he would never wake up alone again. Slowly, painfully slowly, something started to shift. He began exploring the hallway instead of hiding from it. He started climbing onto the bed instead of pressing himself into corners. One afternoon, he discovered a dangling cat toy, and for the first time since he'd been found, he pounced. He played. There were setbacks along the way. Nights when he wouldn't eat. Days when he seemed to remember the wall and pressed himself flat on the floor for hours. Sarah never rushed him. She simply stayed close, the same way she had that very first night, until the fear passed on its own. Weeks turned into months, and the kitten who once couldn't move an inch inside a wall became a kitten who couldn't stop moving at all. He grew stronger every single week, his coat filling out into a deep, rich orange, his once crusted eyes opening into a bright, curious green. And then, at nearly a year and a half old, nobody who saw him could believe what he'd once survived. Today, Sunny is a full-grown cat with a thick, glowing coat and sharp green eyes that seem to notice everything. He stretches out across the biggest, softest spot in the house every afternoon, completely unafraid of open space now. He greets Sarah at the door every evening, presses his face into her hand exactly the way he did the morning he was pulled from the wall. Visitors who see photos of the tiny, trapped kitten from that alley almost never believe it's the same animal sitting in front of them. Sarah still keeps the very first photo she ever took of him, tucked into that gap between the walls, eyes barely open, fur damp and matted. She looks at it sometimes on hard days, just to remind herself what patience and a single fingertip are capable of. From that moment in the wall to this moment right now, he has never once forgotten who reached in first. Because sometimes survival isn't loud. Sometimes it's a single finger pushed through a crack in a wall, in the middle of the night when nobody else was even looking. Sometimes the smallest act of staying is the only reason anything gets to grow at all. Would you have knelt down in that alley at midnight for a sound you couldn't even explain? Or would you have walked past like everyone else did? Tell me in the comments.